than Russia, just in population terms, and much bigger in economic terms. But because we don't speak with one voice, we don't say it.
Yeah. First question is, why does Germany do what it's doing?
I think the Germans are not as concerned as perhaps they should be. At least the German governing elite is not as concerned as it should be about what's going on in Russia. They feel that they are the big European country. They have a special relationship with Russia. And if I was being crude, I would say maybe they feel the other countries don't really count. And the more that impression is given, the more alarmed the other countries become. And I think that Schröder...
You partly have a historical explanation for the German behavior, the historical ties between Germany and Russia.
Well, I think those ties are sometimes admirable and sometimes very unfortunate. And, you know, it's great that Catherine the Great brought the Germans into the Volga to develop Russian agriculture and these tremendous cultural ties. But I think any German policymaker should also always have the words Molotov-Ribbentrop on their minds when they're thinking about anything that affects East European security. And I don't think Schröder understood that, and I don't think Mr. Steinmeier perhaps grasped it as sharply as he should. And
who is the current foreign minister?
Who's the foreign minister and is the inheritor of the Schröder foreign policy. Paradoxically, I think Mrs. Merkel understands it very well. I think Frau Merkel is great, but she's a prisoner because the only two parties in Germany which really agree with her private views on Russia are the Greens and the FDP, who happen to be the opposition. And her coalition partners, the CDU, has a strong business lobby which loves Russia because of the profits, and the SPD likes Russia because it's anti-American and sees Russia as a counterweight to America and inherits the sort of Schröder policy. So she's, in a way, she's a sort of the prisoner of the Kanzleramt sometimes, I think.
And the second question is, why is the EU not acting against this great danger, against this dependency on Russian gas and oil?
Well, I think the EU is trying to. Mr. Piebalgs, the Energy Commissioner, in private and public meetings explains the position very well, but ultimately his power as Energy Commissioner is quite limited. He can only act with the consent of the member states, and the Competition Commission is trying in that perhaps more effectively. But in the end, they too have to worry about going against the interests of the big European countries. And if you have not just Germany, but also Italy, and to some extent Spain, and now the Netherlands also going towards and Austria as well, all going in the sort of pro-Russian direction as far as energy policy is concerned, it makes it very difficult for the Commission to have any convincing alternative collective security policy.
Yeah. Now your remedy is quite radical. Economically, you say kick Gazprom off the European financial market.
Yeah.
That's for a correspondent of The Economist, that must have raised some eyebrows, this political protectionism.
Well, I believe in free markets passionately, and The Economist also does, but I think that free markets exist as an adjunct to other things. They are the basis for the rule of law and for political freedom, and you can't have those without free markets. But we don't run our systems simply in order to make people rich, and certainly the interests of shareholders and of consumers are important. But during the old Cold War, we would not have run our weapons policy, our arms procurement policy, simply on the basis of what was good for the shareholders of the arms companies, or on what weapons are the cheapest. We would have said we need the weapons that will work. And I think energy security is a bit like that now. We can't give the E.ON and Ruhrgas and BASF and Windgas, all these German companies, can't expect that their interests are the same as the German national interest or the European collective interest. And we have to say, maybe you have to pay a bit more for gas, maybe your profits will be a bit less, maybe we have to build nuclear power stations, but ultimately we are not going to run our entire energy policy just to suit you guys. Now, with Gazprom, I think very strongly that we should be saying that the Western financial markets and the Western financial system is not a completely open playing field. We do not allow people to turn up with cocaine money or money from people trafficking and invest it. We do not allow people to turn up with a suitcase of stolen Fabergé eggs and go to the City of London and say, I have some stolen Fabergé eggs here and I need a banker to help me sell them and a lawyer to make it look legal and a PR company to make it look good. If you turn up with a stolen oil company, somehow everything's different. I don't see why it should be.
Yeah. So if you say that big companies, big European companies are acting against national interests and are acting in opposition with, in fact, human rights and human rights policies in Russia, where does that leave good governance within corporations?
Well, I think obviously companies will do business wherever there's money to be made, and we can't stop companies doing business with China or Kazakhstan or Burma or Russia or whatever. But there's a particular point about gas, because gas is unlike oil, where you can buy a tanker of oil from anywhere. Gas almost always comes through pipelines. I think only 7% of world gas comes by tanker with liquefied natural gas. All the rest comes by pipelines. And pipelines create monopolies, because once one pipeline is built, it's very hard to raise the money for a second pipeline. And so the normal considerations of pure free market economics don't quite apply, because you're dealing with an inherent monopoly. And therefore we have to say to the Russians, which we have already said, you need to demonopolize your energy pipeline. Sure, have the physical pipeline, maybe there's only 2 or 3 of them, but make them available to all comers. So if we want to buy Turkmen gas, they ship Turkmen gas. If we want to buy Uzbek gas, they ship Uzbek gas. If they want to buy Kazakh gas, they buy Kazakh gas. If we want to buy gas from Novatek or from some independent gas producer inside Russia, they ship that too. That they don't have the right, which they do at the moment, to say, very sorry, there's only one colour of gas available, and that's Gazprom gas. Or it's gas that we have bought from Central Asia, and we'll sell it to you at the price that we choose. And it's tremendously important, this. Also from a global warming point of view, because there's billions of cubic metres of gas gets flared in Siberia completely pointlessly, because the monopoly pipeline system makes it not efficient for the producers to try and ship it to us, so they just burn it instead.
Politically, your recommendations are just as bold as economically. For instance, you say kick Russia out of the Council of Europe.
Absolutely. This is really important. I'm actually arguing for a two-pronged approach, that we need to engage Russia more on big global issues, because on strategic nukes and on space, Russia is still a really big part. And actually on global warming, it's very important as well. And I'm not at all arguing for a blockade or for isolation. And I've criticised the American administration, both in the book and in my recent trip to Washington, because dominance in nuclear weapons doesn't always equal security. If the Russians go to launch on warning because their arsenal is so small, then everybody's in danger. So on that, I'm saying we should engage more. But on democracy and on values, we have made a big mistake, because we brought Russia into the Council of Europe, I think rightly, perhaps in the 1990s, because we were hoping they were on the right trajectory. Now they're not. And it discredits the whole of the Council of Europe, and in a way that makes it an almost useless organisation, when we have a country where you have psychiatric incarceration of dissidents, blatantly rigged elections, venomous anti-Western propaganda, the glorification of Stalinism. This is another thing that is very troubling in Russia at the moment, the rehabilitation of the Stalinist version of history. And we suspended Belarus for far less. We suspended Belarus on what seems like a technicality now, one rigged election and some minor intimidation of dissidents. And it makes a mockery if we don't do something on that.
Okay, when we follow your recommendations, we'll kick Russia out of the Council of Europe. We'll ban Gazprom from the European financial markets. We'll ban these Kremlin Inc. companies from the stock exchange. Won't that polarize relations even more and push Russia even further down the line it's on, in your view?
I think Russia adopts a tactic that we have seen in the Incredible Hulk movie. Don't get me angry, you won't like me when I'm angry. And in fact, the lesson of the last 10 years is that when the West does act in a united way, Russia gets used to it. Russia said, don't expand NATO. You won't like, if you expand NATO, we will see a sheet of flame across Europe. That was what Yeltsin said. Putin said it would be impermissible to expand NATO to the Baltic states. We did it. It's been a big success, and nothing's happened. And we are not arguing for the dismemberment of Russia. We're not saying that we want total change. We are making some fairly specific things about the way you run your gas pipelines, and that's what it really boils down to. I mean, that would simply opening up the gas pipelines and breaking the Gazprom monopoly would change the balance of power in Europe, and that's, if you like, the front line of the new Cold War. The second thing, pushing back against the Russian advance into Eastern Europe. Again, they have started this confrontation, and they don't respect us because we've not shown ourselves worthy of respect. We don't. They march into these countries, and we are pretty feeble in what we march in. They march in a financial sense, not in a military sense, and we've been pretty weak about pushing back. So, there was an old saying during the Cold War: the Soviet Union reacts very badly to pressure, but without pressure, it doesn't react at all. And I think we need to remember that.
Yeah, but internally, it could lead to a process which you seem worried about too in your book, because by playing in, for instance, to xenophobia, existing xenophobia in Russia, the authorities, in a way, opened a Pandora's box that they cannot control themselves in the end. Couldn't this polarization strengthen developments like that with unpredictable results?
It's certainly a risk, but I think that's already happening. And I think it's fatal to try and run our foreign policy on the basis of the effect it will have on Russian public opinion. And we've tried doing that in the 1990s, and it doesn't work. It's not a close enough connection. And we always end up sacrificing our friends in order to help our enemies, which is a very bad deal. So I think I absolutely agree with you that the current political cocktail is a mixture of the red, the white, and the brown. Red for Soviet nostalgia, white for Tsarist nostalgia, and brown for something that could be called fascism. Now, I'm worried that that's gradually turning black, and I think they've unleashed these demons of xenophobia and racism, maybe for quite cynical reasons, but that demon is out of the bottle now, and I don't know.
And there's not really much we can do about it.
I'm not sure there's much we can do about it, but what we do have to do is to get our moral authority back, because when the last experiment in Russia collapsed, which was the Soviet experiment, it came at a time when the West was riding very high. We had very impressive leaders, Kohl, Reagan, Thatcher, people who really stood for something, and it was quite natural for the Russians and the other ex-Soviet peoples to say, our system hasn't worked, the Western system works better, let's go that way. Now we've lost a lot of that moral authority. This is a very important point I make in the book, that if things go wrong in Russia, as I think they will, because these Chekists are actually quite incompetent, as well as being sinister, I'm not so sure that Russian people would this time look towards the West and say, now we have to make Russia like the West. I think they might think we need something much darker. And I think that's the really worrying outcome. But that's all the more reason to try and be tough now and at least save what we can.
Yeah, because it would seem to me, and you make that point in your book too, that the biggest risk the biggest flaw for Russia in the long term is its lopsided economy. It's depending heavily on raw materials, and the political structure, as you described it, in itself is hampering the development of a real innovative production system. So where will that end?
Well, it's pretty bleak, actually. I mean, they've had this enormous bonanza, this windfall of tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in energy revenues. Where are the new hospitals? Where are the new roads? Where are the new railways? Where are the new power stations? Where are the new universities? Very little's happened. The Russian system is so inefficient, it can't spend large amounts of public money effectively. It gets stolen or wasted. And so that's a bad thing for the future. The demography is catastrophic. Every minute, just over roughly four Russians die, and only 3 are born every minute. And that's going to get a lot worse because we're heading for the demographic cliff based on the collapse of the birth rate 20 years ago. So the women who are needed to give birth in the next few years weren't born back then. And so that's going to be bad. The economy hasn't diversified properly. We see a huge boom in construction, retail, a lot of rather wasteful investment projects, but the economy doesn't have the competitive intensity that it's needed really to innovate and become world-class because it's too protected. It's protected because of the bad infrastructure and the bad institutions, bad customs regime and so on. So the outlook's pretty bleak in sort of 10 to 20 years. But the point I make in the book is that if you're on a wheelchair, then a man on crutches can be pretty